who have lived the message out that are being taught throughout Scripture, that I think it's oftentimes helpful just to look at those examples and stories and see what we can learn from those things and how we can apply those particular things to our life. So that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to look at a story in the Old Testament and look at how these servants in the Old Testament successfully followed the principles that Peter was teaching in 1 Peter chapter 1 and 2. We're going to set the stage, if you will. I'm going to tell you what's going on in the history of the people of Israel, where this story takes place. Then we're going to look at the story itself, and then look how we can learn from that story and apply those same principles today in our life. Now, that's the amazing thing about the Bible. It is always practical. It's always helpful. It's always useful. And if the earth stands for another 2,000 years, the principles found in this book will still be helpful and still be useful. And although the story takes place a long time ago, those principles that we see will be helpful to us. So here's sort of the situation that's happening in Israel at this particular time. There has been a conflict between God's people and the people of Syria for a long time. And that conflict can go all the way back to the time of David. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is one of the key passages in the Bible. It ranks right up there with Genesis chapter 12. Because in 2 Samuel chapter 7, David has wanted to build a temple for the Lord, but the Lord instead promises David that he was going to build his house forever. In chapter 8, David goes on and he starts having some conquests. He goes out and fights battles. As he's fighting these battles, the Lord is with him and he's winning battle after battle after battle after battle. Well, the Syrians come up and join one of David's enemies. And David just slaughters 22,000 Syrians. And all along this time, when he's taking the possessions of these people he's conquering, he finally gets to where he's in the valley of Salt, and the Syrians come up against him again. And he kills another 18,000 Syrians. And he subdues them, he brings them under his leadership, and they pay tribute to him. He takes some of that money back, and he dedicates it to the house of the Lord that he's going to have Solomon build, or Solomon's going to build. And he takes some and puts it in his own treasury. Well, as you can imagine, throughout history, if you know somebody has conquered and killed 40,000 of your people, that's not going to put them in a high standard later on in the history books. Well, if you go to 1 Chronicles chapter 16, you see another incident where there's this battle between the Syrians and God's people. It happens in the day of Asa. Now, Asa was a great king for 36 years. He did great and wonderful things. He has one of the statements in the Bible that has so much faith behind it. It's one that we sometimes overlook, but it is an amazing statement that he makes about the power of the Lord and what the Lord is able to and how the Lord is able to help, whether there are many or whether there are just a few people following after the Lord. And it's a huge statement that he makes there. Lord, it doesn't matter if there's a lot of people or there's just a few you can save. We're just a few. We have no power. Help us. Don't let men fight and win against you. It's a great statement of faith. However, as time goes on, his faith begins to wane a little bit. And Baasha, the king of Israel, is building all these cities in the southern part of Israel. Judah's in the south, Israel's in the north. And Baasha has asked Syria to help him, protect him. Well, what Asa does, Asa goes to Syria and says, I have more money. And so he opens up, goes to the treasury of the Lord, gets some of that money that David had put in there and some others had put there, and he takes that money and says, here's more money, come help us. So he does. The king of Syria goes and helps the people of Judah instead of the people of Israel, and it's just a terrible thing for the people of Israel. They vacate what they're doing, and Asa goes and takes over those cities. And you see that this conflict between the two have gone on forever. Let's look at 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 7. 2 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 7. This is what God says to Asa by the mouth of the prophet. Because you have relied on the king of Syria and have not relied on the Lord your God. Therefore the army of the king of Syria has escaped from your hand. Were not the Ethiopians a huge army and with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose hearts are loyal to him. And this you have done foolishly. Therefore, from now on, you shall have wars. Then Asa was angry with the seer and put him in prison. And he was enraged at him because of this. And Asa oppressed some of the people at that time. So understand this. If Asa had asked God for help, he would have given Israel and Syria into the king's hands. Our setting's going to take place with Syria. So it's important for us to understand what's going on here. If Asa had done what he was supposed to, God would have wiped Syria out at that particular moment. You come to the time of Ahab in 1 Kings chapter 20. In 1 Kings chapter 20, we all know Ahab. He was an evil, wicked king. He had a bad wife. Just awful, awful man. God showed him some favor at one particular point, and he had these battles with Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. And the first battle, they win. Huge. They rout Syria. And God warns him after that battle that Syria is going to come back and fight you again next spring. Be ready for it. 1 Kings chapter 20 and verse 22 says this. And the prophet came to the king of Israel and said to him, go strengthen yourself, take note, and see what you should do. For in the spring of the year, the king of Syria will come up against you. I love this. He's given him warning. Hey, they're coming up against you again in the spring. You go think about it. What do you think you should do when they come up against you? Now, God uses the people of Syria to convince the king to go fight again the next year by saying, oh, the Israelites, their gods are the gods of the hills. That's the only reason they were able to beat us. We'll get them in the plains next spring. We get them in the plains. Our gods are the gods of the plains. Therefore, we will be able to have victory. And so the next year they come and they have another battle. And God delivers Syria into their hands again. And there's this whole waiting and seeing. Is there going to be any mercy in the eyes or in the heart of the king of Israel? And there is. Ahab makes a treaty with the people of Syria instead of destroying them. And in 1 Kings chapter 20 and verse 42, the Bible says this. Thus says the Lord, because you have let slip out of your hand a man whom I appointed to utter destruction, therefore your life should be for his life and your people for his people. So all these things are sort of the backdrop of where our story takes place. There's been this battle between Syria and God's people for all this time. It's gone back and forth. Sometimes God's people are winning, like in the times of David. Ahab had great victory. Other times, the Syrians are having victory over God's people. And our story takes place in 2 Kings chapter 5. And in our story, God's people are losing. I want you to put yourself in this particular environment. We've been so blessed. We've never had a situation in our own homes where we had to hide food because we thought people were going to come in and take it away from us usually. And opposing armies were marching down our streets and all of that good stuff. In our lifetime, we have not experienced that type of thing here at home. But that's the situation. The Syrians have come in and they are routing God's people. I'm going to read the first few verses here of 2 Kings chapter 5. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but a leper. And the Syrians had gone on raids, and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, Naaman goes in and tells him, thus the girl from the land of Israel said, then the king of Syria said, go now, I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. And I just imagine being in that position right then and there. I mean, you're the king. This other nation is having victory over you. They've been taking people off. And all of a sudden, the king of the other side sends a letter to you. Hey, I've sent my best servant your way, my valiant warrior who's had a lot of this success. I want you to heal him of his leprosy. Well, the king's response is, he starts tearing his clothes. He says, who am I? I'm not a god. I can't make alive and make dead. I can't heal a particular person of any particular disease. And in verse 8 it says, so it was when Elisha, the man of God, heard what the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Let's stop the reading right there and make a few points. This servant girl must have had great faith in Elisha and in God. Don't you think? I mean, this is an amazing amount of faith she had both in God and Elisha. She knew that Elisha would be willing and able to help Naaman, and she knew that God would be willing and able to help as well. And I put that there twice because that's a huge point. In order to have faith in God, we must believe that He is both able to help us and that He loves us enough and is willing to help us. Because someone who is able to help us but doesn't care enough about us to help us, we can't put faith in someone like that, right? Or someone who might be able to care enough but can't do it, we can't put faith in someone like that as well. So this young lady had to believe so much in God and Elisha. Because consider this. What would have been the consequences if Naaman were not healed? Man, I wouldn't want to be that girl. You know, if Naaman comes home later on and says, that servant of yours that you said was in Samaria, he wouldn't heal me. Or that God over there, he can't do it. So she put her life in her hands, in God's hands, in Elisha's hands on this particular occasion. Now, why would she have done that? Why would she have been willing to do that? Let's look a little bit at some of the miracles that she had to have known about that Elisha was able to perform. So let's look at 2 Kings chapter 2, 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 19. So we're flashing back a little bit in our story to give this foundation of faith that this young lady had so that she could make these claims that Elisha was able to heal Naaman. They're in Jericho. 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 19. This is after Elisha has gotten the double portion of Elijah. That in and of itself is mind-blowing. Okay, so Elijah has a double portion of Elijah. Elijah has just gone up in a fiery chariot to heaven. Elisha has taken his mantle, touched the Jordan River. The Jordan River has separated, and he's been able to walk through on dry land. That's amazing. Well, there are 50 prophets over there who say, hey, we're not sure Elijah's actually really gone. We think we should go look for him. And Elisha's like, no, he's really gone. Trust me, I saw him go to heaven. Don't go looking for him. You ain't finding him. No. We really think, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Elijah, and he goes here and he goes there. So maybe the Lord carried him up and just dropped him off on a mountain somewhere. We will go look for him. And so he says when he was sort of embarrassed, he goes, all right, fine, go ahead and go. Well, as you can imagine, 3 days later, they come back and they don't find Elijah. They weren't able to go where he was going. So in Jericho, the men of the city, I'm in 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 19, said to Elisha, please notice the situation of this city is pleasant, as my Lord sees. So the city is a good city, but he says the water is bad and the ground is barren. Then he said, bring me a new bowl and put salt in it. So they brought it to him. Then he went out to the source of the water. Just imagine all this. He's taking this bowl of salt. He's going to the source, the spring of the water. He takes this salt. He throws it into the water. And he says, Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. From it shall be no more death or barrenness. So the water remains healed to this day, according to the word of Elisha, which he spoke. Then he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up the road, some youths came from the city, and they mocked him, and they said to him, Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head. So he turned around and he looked at them and pronounced a curse on them in the name of the Lord, and 2 female bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 youths. Then he went up from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. So many things that this girl had to have known about Elisha, and had to have known about this God that Elisha served. Crossed the Jordan on dry land, changed bad water into good water, had 2 bears maul 42 young people. I talked with Shelley and Peyton about this a little bit yesterday. That's just a scene, right? I don't even know if I totally understand that, why he did that. But, I mean, disrespecting an older person, you know, a prophet of God, making fun of him. And then he causes a curse in the name of the Lord, and the Lord sends 2 female bears out to kill 42 young people? I mean, that would have been a massacre. He had that incredible scene where he goes out, and by the command of God, Elisha tells them to dig these trenches. And they dig these trenches, and they destroy the opposing army, because the opposing army sees blood in those trenches. And so they think that they've turned on each other, and so they come in and they're ambushed. All of these things were part of what Elisha was able to do up to this point. He also performed the miracle of the oil and the jar for the widow so that she didn't have to sell her sons into captivity. He raised a widow's son from the dead. And then in 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse 38, it says, And Elisha returned to Gilgal, and there was a famine in the land. Now the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, and he said to his servants, Put on a large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. So one went out into the field to gather herbs, and found a wild vine, and gathered from it a lapful of wild gourds, and came and sliced them and put them in the pot, though they did not know where they came, what they were. And when they served it to the men to eat, now it happened as they were eating the stew that they cried out and said, Man of God, there is death in the pot. And they could not eat it. So he said, Then bring some flour. And he put it into the pot and said, Serve it to the people that they may eat. And there was nothing harmful in the pot. So more miracles that he was able to do. He purified a pot of poisoned stew. He fed 100 men with a small amount of food, and they had some left over. This was the foundation that this girl had to know that some of these things, so that she could with confidence tell Naaman's wife, there is a prophet in Samaria. And if you could get your husband to that prophet I know can and will heal Naaman of his leprosy. Back to our story in 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5. Verse 2 only, we'll read this time. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Understand something about this young lady. This young lady was suffering because of mistakes made by previous leaders. That was our setting, right? If Ahab would have destroyed them like he was supposed to, they wouldn't have been powerful enough to do some of this stuff. And the point that I want to make here is that you and I are pretty small characters in the world story, right? Are there times we suffer because of things other people have done and maybe even 50 or 100 years ago? People that we don't know anything of? Absolutely. Are there things that go on in the world today where big, powerful people are having meetings and there's decisions that they're making that cause us to suffer? Yeah, that was what this girl was. She's been pulled away from home. And just visualize this. This young girl, if you have a young daughter, visualize that daughter being taken away from you and taken to a foreign land. Just think about it, that was you. If you were taken away from your parents and you were taken to someone else's house and said, now you are our servant, you will do what we say, you do these things for my wife, you wait on her hand and foot. That's your job from now on. That's your new lot in life, because Syria is making raids on the Israelites and they are having success. This servant girl was not bitter, even though she was a captive. And it wasn't her fault. Think about this for a second. Would you think any less of this girl if she just kept quiet? I have to say, my heart's penetrated, because I'm okay with just not helping the guy. Okay, taking me away from my family. You know, he's done all these things. He's not God's people. They don't serve the Lord. So I'm just not going to do him any harm. I'm going to do the things that I'm supposed to do because I have to. And that's all I'm going to do. She has a great example. She's a great example to me in doing what she did, even though she really didn't have to. She was proactive in helping this particular guy. Now, the text does say that God gave victory to Naaman. That's important, because I want you to turn now, keep your markers there, and turn back to our text in 1 Peter chapter 2. Now, Peter gives us one particular example that we're not talking about this morning, and just sort of how sometimes it's so helpful to go link back to one of these stories. He uses the story of Sarah, right? Let's link back to Sarah to see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the relationship between husbands and wives. So I think it's valuable for us to link back here. So 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13 says this: "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake." Look at verse 19. "For this is commendable, if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God." And then in chapter 3, you could read all of that about the woman to have a gentle and quiet spirit. But in verse 6 it says, "As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughter you are if you do good and are not afraid with any terror." So here's an important point about this idea of who do we submit to and how do we submit and what's our attitude about submission. All submission is ultimately submission to God and for God. So no matter who we're called upon in this life to submit to, we are submitting to them because it is to God and it is for God that we submit. I think that's a huge point. It's a mindset shifter, right? And if that's all we're able to accomplish through this story is say, hey, I got to change the way I think about submission. All submission is to God and for God. That would be a huge, huge, huge blessing for us. Go back to chapter 5 of 2 Kings. So we're back to our story. She says to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy." And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel." She did the only thing she could do. She told Naaman who could help him. Sometimes the only thing we can do is tell somebody else who can help them. And it may be Jesus, it may be God, it may be, see, this is how this has gone. It's gone from the girl to the wife to Naaman to the king, to Elisha. That's a long circle, right? And before you finally get the two together. So it might be what you're able to do is you're able to put someone in contact with another Christian who might be able to help another person get one step closer to God and to Jesus. 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 8. I'm sorry, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Love as brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous. I'm just going to, for time's sake, the word compassion here. This girl had compassion for a guy who knew he had taken her away from her family and everything she knew. That's huge. That's such a good example for us to follow. So let's go on and look at some other servants in the story. 2 Kings chapter 5, 9 through 14. We know this story, this part of the story very, very well. Elisha doesn't come out. He says, go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. Naaman is furious. He's mad about this because what he thought the prophet would at least give him some respect. Come out himself, wave his hands over Elisha and pray to his God and heal Naaman of his particular infirmity. But Elisha doesn't do it that way. And so he's all these things. Aren't the rivers in Damascus better than all the rivers here? And he's going on and on and on and on about how a travesty and how upset he is. And it says he turned away in a rage. Now, if you're one of the servants, you have a choice to make. Hey, this guy's upset. I'm just going to leave him alone. Or you can look at your servant, your master, and say, he's making a very foolish decision right now. And so I'm going to try to do whatever I can to influence him to make a better decision. And they do just that. I mean, Naaman was a lucky guy. I mean, he was a lucky guy to have that servant girl. He was a lucky guy to have all these other servants that were thoughtful of him. And now he was what the Bible describes him as, an honorable person to a certain degree. But here you have his servants saying, look, if this guy had told you to go out and do something big, you would have done it in a heartbeat. If he told you to go conquer a city, you would have done that. If he told you to do something difficult, but he's just telling you to go down to the Jordan River and do something simple. Just dip, immerse yourself in that river 7 times. That's it, and you'll be healed of your leprosy. So he listens to his servants. He goes down and he dips in the river 7 times, and he's totally healed of his leprosy. These men, his servants, influenced him by giving him good advice. I can almost guarantee you, all of us, can serve those in authority over us simply by giving them good advice. Amen. Lots of times you can do that. Not hostile, not in their face, not how could you do something so dumb, how could you be so rebellious. Just say, look, let's look at it another way. If he had asked you to do this, you would have done it. What he's asking you to do is pretty simple. Just go ahead and do that. And the logic and the reasoning eventually made sense to him, and he was able to do that. There are a lot of other examples in the Bible of this taking place. In Daniel chapter 4, we know that Daniel was a good advice giver. Joseph was a good advice giver. Nathan was a good advice giver, not just to David, but he was a good advice giver to Bathsheba when David's other son took over as king. Wasn't supposed to, but he took over as king, and Nathan gave her very, very good advice. I'm just going to bring to your memory another story, and that is found in Exodus chapter 1 when Pharaoh tells the midwives to kill all the babies of Israel that are born. And I've labeled this abuse of power, and Brian noted this in our class. You have to draw some lines, right? You have to draw some lines, and lines are clearly drawn when something's a sin. And so these ladies were told to murder these babies, and they said, no way. They feared God, and they would not do it. In Exodus 1 and verse 19, it says this, and the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and they give birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. Now, midwives generally had no families. And so on this particular occasion, they feared God more than they feared the king, the most powerful person in the world. And so God says, I'm going to give you a family as a result of this. And so God blessed them. So there are always boundaries in submission. Now, as Americans, I'll be honest with you, I struggle with some of this stuff, right? Because I just want to do what I want to do. I just want to make my own decisions and say, everybody else just get out of my life. You know, you want to do this, you do it, but I'm doing it the way I want to do it. And I think all of us have that in us. And it might just be human nature. It might be a whole bunch of other things that lead us to this. But I want to give you some things to think about. Sometimes when knowing how to handle a situation, if you just ask yourself some questions and answer those questions honestly, it can really help you. And the first question is simply this: what are my motives? If you are faced to a situation, why don't I want to do this? Why do I have this tendency to rebel right now? Why do I have a tendency not to want to do what someone in authority over me is telling me to do? What are my motives on this particular occasion? Check that out to find out make sure your motives are right. Is how I'm handling this situation going to help anyone glorify God? Is how I'm handling this situation going to put to silence the ignorance of foolish men? Is how I'm handling this situation going to help someone get to heaven? Just sit down, have a talk with yourself, and say, all right, Dwayne, well, what are your motivations here? All right, Dwayne, if you do it this way, the way you want to do it, is that going to help anyone glorify God? Is that going to help anyone get to heaven? Is it going to make a positive difference in anyone's life? Am I seeing the big picture? How can I fill the gaps of my knowledge? I think this is huge because Brian used an illustration of looking through a straw since I've been here. If we don't go back and look at history like we did to start this lesson, and look at all the things that brought this situation to be, we don't understand it all. And think about this for a second. You know what's going to happen in the next couple chapters? It's the story where one lady kills her baby and two ladies eat it. This young servant girl had enough wisdom to know that maybe Naaman is not my enemy. Maybe Naaman has saved me from some tragedy. She didn't have all the information. You don't either. Okay? You don't either. So sometimes when situations are happening, you got to take a step back and say, all right, am I seeing everything clearly? If I'm not seeing everything clearly, how can I get more information? Can you go ask the person in authority, a parent, right? A husband, a boss at work? You say, you know, I'm having trouble understanding this. Could you clarify your reasoning for me a little bit? How many times have you not wanted to do something, didn't understand something until someone explained it to you and you're like, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. I can easily do that. I understand that. So instead of just letting everything boil up within you and get mad and angry and all this good stuff and want to lash out and do the total opposite thing that God wants you to do, just go ask some clarifying questions of somebody. Why do you want me to do this? What are the advantages of doing it this way? Herb and I had one of those short conversations the other day. He was trying to tell me to do something different on something I had done. And I said, I'm just curious. I'm not saying it's a bad idea or a good idea. I'm just curious why you want it done this way. And he looked at it and said, I don't really care if it's done that way or not. All right, so I'm fine. We came to some kind of solution, but it was just an easy, simple thing just to ask him, why do you want it done this way? And once he explained it to me, or I explained to him why I didn't do it that way, we were able to come up with a resolution pretty quickly on that particular thing. Can I go ask someone else to help fill the gaps in my knowledge as well? And then the questions there for house to house, I think they're going to spark some discussion as we think about the things that are going on in our country. You look at the headlines. Go to the major news channel headlines today, and how many headlines are about somebody forcing somebody to do something. So I think this lesson is so practical because we are going to be asked here in the near future, I believe, to continue to do a whole bunch of stuff we don't want to do. Right? It's going to come back. It was here last year. It's going to come back. And we have to decide how we're going to handle that. Is how we handle this going to glorify God? Is it going to lead anybody to Christ? Is it going to make me a good example? Is it going to allow me to be one of these evildoers that they're speaking evil of and allow that to come true again? Or am I going to handle this in a godly way? The Bible is so practical. It has so much good stuff in it for us to look at. And you would do well this week if you just reread that story 2 or 3 times and just thought about it all week. What would I have done if I were that girl? What would I have done if I were Naaman? What have I had done if I were Elisha? What would I have done? Just live that story over and over and over again, and then apply those principles to the things that we're facing today in our society. The one thing we can all agree on, at least I think in this building, is that we must submit our lives to God without question. I love that song, All to Jesus I Surrender. That's where you got to be. And if you haven't surrendered to Jesus, and if you haven't been washed in His blood to have your sins taken totally away from you, you can do that right now. Or if you're a Christian that needs prayers in any way for the help of this group, please come as together we stand and sing.